The following program is a UW-TV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. Pepper Schwartz is considered one of this country's leading authorities on interpersonal relationships. American Couples, a study she co-authored with the late Philip Blumstein, is considered a landmark analysis of relationships and how they're shaped by money, work, and sex. Schwartz is a professor of sociology at the University of Washington, and her next book explores what she calls peer marriage, how love works between equal partners. Welcome to Upon Reflection.
Thanks.
In American Couples, you wrote that one of the reasons that you took that study on was that relationships in general and marriage in particular were in flux and seemed to be growing more fragile. And that study was published in 1983. In the decade that's passed, have they gotten more or less fragile?
Well, you see the shards amongst us. Yeah, if they were cracked, now they're just kind of crumbled. All the trends I think that we were looking there have just intensified. Higher divorce, more doubt about the institution of marriage per se, higher percentage of the population in their second or third marriage, higher percentage cohabiting. In general, more doubt about what marriages can be for a lifetime.
And yet, when you look at the history of not necessarily marriage, you know, the traditional marriage, the wedding cake, the bride, the groom, the couple is an incredibly stable unit of companionship.
Well, the sociologists call it pair bonding, and I think they have something there. I don't generally like to give them credit, but I will just to be, universalistic. But no, I think they do, which is to say that we are an animal that likes to make a cohesive relationship. And we will try and do that, whether we can maintain it over a long life cycle, which we've now constructed by dint of medicine, et cetera, is another question. But yeah, we have hopes and we have desires. We wish to mate and we wish to protect that mating. I don't think we want to stop pair bonding. Question is, can we do it forever with the same individual?
As we look at this image of us picking our way through the shards of relationships, does that image change at all when we move away from the traditional definition, sort of the traditional equation of the male and the female marriage?
No, to some extent I think it gets rougher. Institutional marriage, as it was traditionally put together, was not supposed to be this higher form of fulfillment, love, romance, sex. It was supposed to be for survival and reproduction, pretty much that,
practical.
Maybe kinship. It was practical, it was a rough world, and this was the unit that was going to help you get through it. If that's what you want to achieve, you can do that. If you want to achieve a best friendship, a love affair, sexual ecstasy, well, we're now talking stuff that's harder to do. So if you want tradition, which is to say, forget all this emotional stuff, you want to survive, you can do that. If you want a deep personal relationship, that's an art form.
And that takes a lot of work.
It takes a lot of work, and it takes a little bit of luck, and it takes a good deal of emotional maturity to get through the tough times, of which there will always be some.
Now, when you look at relationships, there's the relationship between the two people and all of the pressures and the complexities of that. Then there's the context in which the relationship is taking place and all of the pressures and complexities that puts on each of them individually and then together as a couple. Which of those pressures is tougher? I mean, if you have to pick one or the other, can the two people look at the outside world and say, we're going to cope with all of that, or is that just insurmountable if it's working against them?
Well, I think people who are smart pick a context that is supportive for what they're trying to accomplish. If you have family that are supportive of your relationship, then those are relationships to nurture and to be entered into a community of support. If you have a family that's tearing you apart, maybe that's when you go to Alaska. If you have external pressures that help you create your relationship, then those are ones you want to encourage. But it's a very particular kind of thing.
You studied both what you called mixed couples, heterosexual couples in your book, and also same-sex couples. And one of the things that has really become a force, it was a paragraph in American Couples talking about AIDS. And it's emerged as so much bigger a force in the last 10 years. How has that affected same-sex couples?
I think it's actually affected all couples, same-sex, of course, the most visibly and appropriately, and male couples within that generic grouping. For one thing, it's modified non-monogamy in gay men. To have a sexual experience outside the relationship wasn't considered that big a deal 10 years ago. Today, it's putting your relationship not only emotionally at risk, but it's a life and death matter. That's changed, in a sense, the kind of work men have to do, in a sense, to rechannel some of that energy and imagination and restlessness back in the relationship. In heterosexual couples, I think it's had an impact too, particularly in dating people or people who haven't made just their commitment yet, because they're afraid. And again, appropriately so, not with the same level of risk as gay men, but there is this sense of it is really quite dangerous out there, and what am I risking here, and what am I getting? So it's changed the equation a bit.
What about the status of women, how that has shifted in the last 10 years and how that plays into the ability of couples to make it through?
I think the status of women has been incrementally growing, but I almost think the better reference is the last 30 or 40 years as opposed to the last 10 years, because I think they're modest, but all in the same directions of better financial power through better employment, more negotiations between men and women about what their relationship is going to be, fewer assumptions.
Certainly more women in the workforce.
Oh, you know, we're thinking now by the turn of the century it will almost be universal employment of women. And these things change, and it's also women are working themselves through the pipeline. We're now getting women who are the heads of things, and they often turn around and mentor downward. I think men are now starting to reevaluate the provider role, which is something that I've always found interesting studying, and that is this idea that if you're a man, it's your duty to support the family financially, and in return you get a few favors, like you never have to pack your own suitcase, right? You don't have to know where the
bathroom,
you know, or know where the butter is. I mean, those kinds of things. But in fact, men are looking at this deal and they're thinking, well, she's no longer telling me all my jokes are funny. Maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea if I didn't have to be totally responsible for the economics of this household. And so now you're not getting women who are the provider so much, but you're getting women who are now not having work as voluntary, not just because they need it for lifestyle, because we know it's very hard to be middle class or anything else without two people working, but also now because they're saying, you want an equal partnership, you're going to have to be part of the financial equality of this relationship too.
And in fact, in some industries, like the fashionable word that are downsizing right now, women are the members of the unit that are staying employed, and the men are not being able to find jobs. Something that could very well have another profound impact and reshape marriage.
I think money is an extremely important impact on how couples interact. The place where the buck stops is usually the place where the orders start, I think. And everybody can say we're this corporate entity, but there's nothing like looking at couples in divorce to notice how corporate that thing is once it starts to fall apart. Suddenly tags, you know, reappear on everything in the household. Your mother gave me that, you know, and my aunt, that silverware was meant for me, etc. And what's happened is people have watched this and realized that it isn't a joint creation economically, that there really is some necessity to be able to survive individually as an economic entity. And that has changed, I think, the way people go about marriage and what kinds of sacrifices they will make within it.
One of the parts of a marriage that's hard to, you know, stick a Post-it note on when things turn bad are children. And so far we've been talking all about the adults. Do we know enough yet about the children of the shards, the children who come home to an empty house, the children who go back and forth between parents?
When the divorce revolution first started, the women who were leaving these relationships, and many were asserting their independence, were saying how much better it was, all of us liberals were saying, how much better it was for kids to get out of conflicted, difficult homes than be caught in the nastiness of a marriage that wasn't working. Over the last 20 years, we've had to admit that while that may be true in many cases, that a highly conflicted, ugly home is not a good place for a kid, that neither is a home where the mother's gone working, where the economics are fragile, where the father doesn't visit nor support his child, which is not true, of course, of all fathers, but infinitely more true than we wish it was. And that in this change in what men and women are willing to put up with to stay married to each other, the great victims have been the kids. They're just not getting what they need in general. And there's starting to be industries to help them, whether it's therapeutic or after-school programs, year-round school, but they're all coping mechanisms, none of which substitute for the commitment and love of as many people as you can get, you know, to want your life to continue to be good. And I don't mean just the parents, too, because what divorce also does is disable the kin group, the grandparents, the aunts and uncles, all those other people
have to choose
that invest
sides.
in you.
People disappear.
Yeah, people move, you know. Our country and other countries beset by divorce are simply gasping to keep up with trying to figure out what to do for these children.
You mentioned other countries. Is this a situation that is shared in a lot of different countries around the world?
Yes, but we're number one. I mean, for those of you Americans who are ambitious out there, we have an exceptionally high divorce rate worldwide. Canada is about a third less, which is interesting since they're so clearly a similar kind of neighbor. On the other hand, a country as different from us and as traditional and as controlled as Japan is now almost at a 20% divorce rate. So it's intriguing.
Why do we have this dubious distinction of being number one in this category?
Well, I have various thoughts about it. I'm not sure I could, you know, bet the house on this one, but I think it's a combination of us having a fairly lush economy. We can leave our marriages because we can survive, maybe not as good as we would together, but we can survive. Women can get employed, therefore A, they can leave, and B, men can leave them. We're a relatively unreligious country, so that a lot of times we divorce as opposed to separate. A lot of countries have very high separation ratios that are different from the divorce ratios. We'll just divorce. There was a time, for example, in Boston when it was a more religious type of city where the desertion and separation rates were higher than the divorce rates. Moreover, we're a very individualistic country. We believe in the individual's welfare as opposed to the collective welfare. We believe in the person rather than the family, the individual rather than the kin group. So we're not going to stay and sacrifice for those concepts as they might in other countries.
So in this situation, how do you find the peer relationship, and what is it?
Well, when I tell people I did a book, I'm just finishing it right now as we speak, trying to get it out for the spring, we'll see, of couples who do everything, you know, as a collaboration where the men share in the housework and they share in the child raising, but really very equally, no more than a 60-40 split. And they share in the economic survival of the marriage, and they share in the decision making. And then people sort of stop me and they say, well, who are these two people that you found, you know? But in fact, while it is definitely a minority, of course, there's lots of couples out there who do just that. They may hire some of these things. The more, obviously, ability you have to hire someone to do your shopping or help with your cleaning or whatever, the less there is to split and negotiate over. But they're not necessarily rich people. In fact, in the couples that I looked at, they tend to be men who are not extremely high earners. They might be like school teachers or people like that, where they have sort of matched incomes. Because often when you have what you might think would be these peer couples, two attorneys earning a couple $100,000 apiece, they want a lot for that income. And if the man's earning a real lot, no matter what the woman's earning, and there still tends to be men earning more, he kind of wants to vote some of those shares that he owns. And a lot of the things, even forget the money, that you want from a shared partnership, like, you know, who picks the kid up, and if the kid's sick, who takes him to the doctor, et cetera, they're in careers that don't permit that. You know, they really are not going to get out of a long trial. Big-time litigator is not going to say, excuse me, I can't argue my case today, I'm doing X. So those things undercut their ability to really put together this lifestyle. And a lot of these people have very determinedly decided not to maximize income or not to seek certain kinds of lifestyle so they can concentrate on family and each other. It's almost a common theme there. They look great, I think.
So it's almost as though if you make the decision to go high end on income, you have to be aware that you're going to give things up in terms of the time you're going to have to devote to your relationship. Is it better to not make so much money?
Well, that's an individual decision, of course. I do think every time you give away control in your life, you know, you're paying for something there. You may be gaining something like income and glory and self-fulfillment. I mean, only the individual can decide if a trade is worth it. But, you know, the more you get paid, usually, you know, maybe if you make widgets, you know, you can control your time, which is great. You know, the factory's just doing the widgets and you're making money and you have free time. But if you're a professional where people are buying your hours, there's only so much of you to give.
My head's sort of spinning about this because I'm going back through American Couples and the assessment about money in that book, in which it said really the amount of money you were making was less important than the values that you had about the money.
Well, yes and no.
Is this consistent or contradictory to that?
Well, it's kind of parallel in some ways. What it normally referred to is that women often didn't vote their stock if they didn't believe they should. In other words, if you make a lot of money and you don't believe that you should be the head of the family, you just hand it over, or you pool it and he controls it. You have to have a framework to operate in, and most often women didn't often feel they were entitled to make senior decisions, and so they didn't. They had to believe they were entitled to vote that. But in other cases, it was true that in general, the person with the most money was much more likely to make decisions.
So in your new study in peer marriages, the decision about money, the role it's going to play, is one factor. Any other striking discoveries?
Well, I think you get a lot of men in there who are more child-centered than a lot of other men. Part of the whole configuration of this is not because these men are trapped into being with their kids, but they seriously want to be with their kids.
Any clues as to why?
You know, I'm not a psychologist, so I didn't go into like their home family backgrounds. I was more curious about how they did it now. But these are men who you would generally say are men who've learned how to be sensitive to women's perspectives about life, and they've bought a lot of it. They like the sort of feminist interpretation of life. They're also sometimes men who've been in a first unsuccessful marriage where they did it completely traditionally and the thing blew up in their face. Or they have the marriage break up for other reasons, and now they have an ex-wife who's very dependent on them. And they don't want that responsibility. They would like to have somebody who is more of an equal in terms of carrying their load of the relationship. So they never, ever would have done this the first time. But the second time, they're looking at what they lost and the responsibilities they have and whether or not they'd like somebody who can help them figure out life as opposed to having to be the leader all the time. So some of it's past emotional history, some of it's certain things about children and family and a heavy investment there. A lot of it, there is some temperament in here. One of the things I've seen in a lot of these men is the ability to accept female anger and to give it a certain amount of credibility, you know, to understand where it might come from in women and in sort of the general social structure and to respond to that. And these women, I think, are women too who have things to prove for themselves as individuals. They ask more of their partner. So
it's an overlapping of what's been considered traditional male behavior and traditional female behavior. It's
kind of like
a meeting
there's
of the two.
if you look at it like a line, these are people who are kind of in the middle here. And I think the thing that they feel, you know, I have a whole chapter on this, that they get the most out of it is what I call in the book deep friendship. Which is that we all say our partner's our best friend, but what I do is hold up these friendships to the norms of platonic friendship. You know, I mean, best
Real
friendship,
friendship.
real friendship, right? Which is, would you do this to your friend, and what would you expect of them, and what are the circumstances under, you know, I mean, there are things that I think people do with partners that they wouldn't ask, expect, or tolerate from anybody who wasn't their spouse. Well, you know, how do these people really do it? Would it stand up to those expectations in non-married relationships? And would they get the same kind of emotional feedback and support that they would from a close girlfriend, you know?
It's fascinating. You have to come back and talk when that book comes out, and
I'll
we'll
be
talk
happy
in
to,
depth
of
about
course.
peer relationships. I read a quote from you once where you said that there were people who went into your field to kind of use it to experiment with their own lives, and you said that was something that you thought was extremely dangerous.
Well, I was talking in particular about psychologists, and I'm kind of a social psychologist. And I think the most dangerous one, for example, is where you go in because you have some insight into it, which is great because then you can, you know, understand other people, but then you project your own feelings relentlessly about what this all means, you know, as opposed to put it in each individual context. The area of I've seen it the most dangerous, quite honestly, and this is a controversial area, is for people who, example, work with incest and sexual abuse victims, et cetera. Some of these people have had their own terrible times with it, and I'm completely sympathetic, but I think some of them never resolved it.
So they project
And
that
they keep
onto other
working
people.
it out through their therapeutic regimes of, you know, sort of stoking anger instead of finalizing things and going on with your life.
Why did you choose this field?
Sociology, that's a good question. I think part of it was that I actually got interested first in sex. So why wouldn't someone be interested in sex? But I'll tell you,
Sounds logical.
Well, I'll tell you a real story about, I mean, I was born to this field when I was 11 years old. Do we have time for this story? This is a true story.
Sure.
I had a little girlfriend, Francie, come running to me at my house, screaming and crying and scared because her mother caught her masturbating and told her she was going to go to hell. And my mother had given me all these sex ed books. I had, you know, a very progressive mother, and I said, no, on page 42 it says, you know, you're not going to go to hell. This is okay. And she was very happy. So I thought, you know, I had this surge of, you know, self-esteem, power. My gosh, I'd saved Francie's life. So then I organized a little sex education group in my basement where we'd sit around. We called it the Change of Life Club. It's a little bit of a funny title.
Early, but...
Yeah, but our lives were changing. We were all getting our periods. And again, I put a little newsletter out and whatever. And I guess right early, I know, I was thinking, you know, these are things we can share, you know, as girlfriends, and we can learn, and, you know, all the kind of basic things. And it wasn't like I knew from thence on I was going to study sex and gender and whatever, but it was always something that intrigued me from very early on. And then when I hit graduate school in particular, I was interested in undergraduate, it was the women's movement. It was the civil rights movement. And then who couldn't be interested in these topics?
You wrote a guide to sex on campus when you were in college. How much of that would hold up today, or how different is it on college campuses?
Oh, it's a lot different. I mean, that was a kind of where to put tab A and slot B kind of book, you know. It was you know, sort of basic education information for undergraduates. And, you know, now they know so much. One would, it's not that you wouldn't put the same kinds of things in, but there would be a much more sophisticated information.
So
you know,
it doesn't
the average,
seem like it's gotten any easier for the sexes to get along.
No, that's the hard stuff. And the hard stuff is treating each other with decency and respect and being humane. And that's like a lifelong lesson that we all have, and it's hard to write in a book. But it was about safety, and it was about knowledge. I mean, you can never assume that some people don't know very rudimentary things. You want them to take care of themselves.
One of the things that I notice about your work is that you're not strictly an academic, and even though you've been on the Oprah shows and those types of shows, you're not, you know, you haven't written a book like "My Husband is like a brick wall and I still love him, why?"
I tried to sell
you
it.
could probably make a lot of money doing that, but it must be you've made a decision not to do that.
Well,
Talk show with a mic, you know, remote microphone, that kind of thing.
I think I really like being an academic. I like it because you're in a critical community that keeps you honest, keeps you learning. keeps telling you what you do and you don't know. I like writing for journals because it's an intellectual mind sharpener. And I do think you need the review of peers, not to get full of yourself and start pontificating about, what's going to happen in Bosnia. I do try and write for a general audience. I do write in magazines, and I do talk on TV because I think it's important to translate the best research you can either do or gather to a general audience. But what I do think is that when people take that stuff and stop trying to be true to what we know and the limits of what we know, then it undermines people's believability. And then they go out and they take information from everybody. Part of what I like to do, and I like to see other academics do, is to try and offer good information and say what its limits are. And that gives me, a feeling like I'm doing something good for people. And I come from a background that you're supposed to do good for other people.
And do good you do. Yeah. Now, do you think there's so many how to, what's wrong, helpful shows, all this kind of thing. Do they really do any good? Do they help anybody?
I think they do, actually, if they don't get too far out. There is an enormous number.
Some of them do.
Some of them are awful, and they're irresponsible, and they say things that take my breath away. They're just wrong, dead wrong. But there are an enormous number of people out there that will not go see a therapist unless they get, enormous encouragement from the media, that are frightened, that have hit terrible things, and that see somebody out there and connect to them, and that's who they want to hear from. And so people who are on the air really have to be responsible because there is a huge audience for them. And, I get letters, they break your heart, and they're incredibly open about things that you wish they wouldn't even sign their names to, There are people searching for help. So I think they do give support if the people who are on TV or writing these columns or whatever don't get glib and try and stay within the limits of what they can safely say. Unhappily, a lot of people don't do that, and it scares me silly.
Yeah, take it seriously because the audience does.
Yeah.
Pepper Schwartz, I want you to come back when your next book is published. We'll talk some more.
Thank you very much.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.